After 10 years building a billion-dollar empire for my wife's family, I was fired by my sister-in-law to make room for her sketchy boyfriend. They thought they'd buried me. What they didn't know, I owned the foundation they stood on, and I was about to pull the plug. 10 years. That's how long I gave to the Harrington family business. I started in a tiny back room with a laptop, 2 temps, and a phone that barely worked. Logistics, procurement, supply chain optimization, I handled it all. What started as chaos turned into one of the most efficient operations in the state. By the 3rd year, I had tripled margins. By the 5th, we were regional leaders. But no matter how high I climbed, I always made sure my loyalty stayed with one man, Richard Harrington. He wasn't just my boss. He was my mentor, my father-in-law, and the reason I married into the family. My wife Jessica, his youngest daughter, used to joke that Richard and I talked more than she and I ever did. Maybe that should have been a warning. Richard trusted me with everything. Sensitive mergers, legal loopholes, proprietary systems. He handed them to me because I delivered results. "You're the future," he once told me after I salvaged a botched acquisition. "If I had a real son, I'd want him to be you." He meant it, but he never wrote it down. That's where the cracks began. Richard got sick 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Quiet diagnosis, even quieter exit. He didn't want a farewell tour. He just vanished into private treatment abroad. When it came time to pass the baton, he didn't pick me. He chose his oldest daughter, Madison. Madison Harrington had a marketing degree, an expensive wardrobe, and a talent for winning people over in 10 seconds or less. But running a logistics empire? That was never her lane. Still, with Richard out of sight, the board nodded and she slid into the corner office like it was a family heirloom. And then came Derek, Madison's boyfriend, self-proclaimed tech visionary, recent crypto genius, and full-time fraud in designer sneakers. He'd never built anything in his life except a buzzword-heavy LinkedIn profile and a string of bankrupt shell companies. But Madison thought he was the next Elon Musk. Or at least she needed someone to validate her new authority, and Derek played the part. From the minute he showed up, things started changing. He whispered suggestions, she took them as gospel. Suddenly, key meetings went on without me. My team was reassigned. Budget decisions started bypassing my desk. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Then I realized it was a plan. But I didn't confront them. I stayed silent. I watched, and I documented everything. The final blow came during a quarterly board meeting, one I had organized and was set to lead. I'd spent 2 months developing a $12 million regional expansion strategy that could have doubled our output in a year. The boardroom was full. Madison walked in late, Derek right behind her, both smiling like they already knew how the meeting would end. 5 minutes into my presentation, Madison raised her hand. "We're going in a different direction," she said, cutting me off mid-sentence. The room froze. She didn't even glance at my proposal. "We're pivoting to a younger, more innovative leadership model," she added, then turned to Derek, who looked like he'd just won a reality show. "You've done enough, Ethan. We won't be needing your services anymore." Laughter trickled in from a few board members who'd clearly been prepped. Even Jessica just stared down at her notepad. I looked at each of them. No anger, no panic, just quiet calculation. "Understood," I said calmly. "I'll clear my office tonight." Madison raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem upset." "Oh, I'm not," I replied, standing. "In fact, tomorrow's going to be fascinating." And I meant it, because while they were busy plotting their little coup, I'd spent the last 2 years building a silent fortress. They thought they were firing the help. They were about to learn I was the foundation. The night they fired me, while the others toasted with champagne in the boardroom, I sat alone in my locked office and opened the drawer nobody else knew about. Inside was a single sheet of paper, one that would decide the future of the company. It was a signed contract, just 1 page, marked Addendum 14C. Richard had signed it 6 years ago, the night we pulled the company out of a $28 million lawsuit. I'd built a workaround system that kept their suppliers running while legal handled the mess. In return, Richard poured us both a drink and handed me this paper. "For your loyalty," he said. "No matter what happens, The clause was simple. I would retain joint ownership of all digital infrastructure, intellectual property, and operational software developed under my direction. It specifically stated the agreement would survive any leadership change. And I had kept receipts. Every line of code, every licensing agreement, every patent. I made sure my name was tied to them. That night, I logged into my private server and began Phase 1. By midnight, every software license I had personally built and licensed to Harrington Logistics was disabled. The customer support dashboard offline. The warehouse automation platform frozen. The inventory sync algorithm that kept deliveries on time terminated. By 6 a.m. I was having coffee at home when the calls started. First came the IT director, asking if I'd noticed any errors in the systems. I told him to refer to management. Then Madison called at 8:03 a.m. Voice shrill and panicked. "What did you do?" she snapped. "The back end is down. Orders aren't processing. Our fulfillment centers are frozen." I kept my tone neutral. "You should refer to Addendum 14C. It's a binding agreement your father signed. You're bluffing. Check your email. And have Derek check his. He'll find something interesting too." She hung up. I knew what she'd find because I'd scheduled it. By 9 a.m. every major investor had received an anonymous email. Subject line: "Before you trust Derek with your money." Attached was a 63-page document compiled by a private investigator I'd hired 6 months earlier. I didn't like Derek the moment I met him. He talked too fast and never answered a question directly. So I ran a background check. Turns out he wasn't just arrogant. He was dangerous. 2 sealed fraud cases in Nevada. A trail of failed startups with funds mysteriously disappearing. Lawsuits pending in multiple states for misappropriation of investor money. He had faked advisory roles at companies that didn't exist anymore. But the worst? A voice recording from a phone call with an old college buddy. "If I can get Madison to trust me," he said, "I'll drain that company dry. She's desperate to prove herself easy target." That recording was the headline. The rest was just supporting evidence. By 11:30 a.m. investor calls were overwhelming the company's switchboard. The stock price dropped 7% in an hour. A key logistics partner suspended operations. And Derek? He vanished, turned off his phone, didn't show up at the office. His condo was empty by noon. Madison tried spinning it as a system upgrade glitch and an unfortunate misunderstanding. But it was too late. She hadn't just lost control. She'd lost credibility. The board, once whispering behind her, now openly questioned her judgment. By 3 p.m. the emergency board meeting was underway. But the one who called it wasn't Madison. It was Richard Harrington. After 2 years of silence, he returned without warning. Flew in from Monaco. No statements, no fanfare. Just a direct order to convene in person. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it from 3 different board members within the hour. He walked in, scanned the room, and asked a single question. "Where is Ethan?" Madison tried to answer. He shut her down. "He warned you. You didn't listen. Now you expect him to clean up your mess?" She tried to argue. He told her to sit. That night, my phone rang again. Not Madison this time, Richard. "I know you shut the systems down," he said. "Do you still have the recovery protocol?" "I do. We need you back." "I'm not coming back as your employee," I told him. "If I return, it's as CEO. Full control. You and Madison both step down." He didn't argue. Deal. The next morning, I walked into that boardroom, not as the son-in-law, not as the loyal operator, but as the man they underestimated. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I just laid out the plan to rebuild what they broke. My first order? Reassign Derek's former office. Janitorial staff's been asking for extra space. Nobody laughed out loud, but a few smirks gave them away. What mattered most was this. I was back in control. But I wasn't there to stay. I didn't come back to save the company. I came back to make sure the people who tried to bury me paid in full. In public, my return was framed as a miracle turnaround. The investors were relieved. Operations resumed within 48 hours after I restored the back-end systems. Customers were reassured, partners returned, and the stock price started to recover. To the outside world, I was the prodigal executive who came back and saved the empire. But inside, I was cleaning house. First, I revoked every contract Madison had approved in the past 12 months. Most were shady, overpriced vendors linked to Derek's network, unnecessary consulting retainers, and inflated software licenses we never needed. I canceled them all. Then I dug deeper. I found that Derek had pushed through a shell acquisition, buying a worthless AI startup run by one of his old roommates using company funds. It had no product, no customers, just a slick pitch deck. We'd spent nearly $4 million on that deal. Gone. I exposed it in front of the board during my second week back. Here's the company Derek said would revolutionize our analytics, I said, pulling up the documents. This is the founder. And here's a bank transfer to his personal account 3 days after the acquisition. Silence. Then one of the senior board members nodded slowly. Keep going. So I did. Madison, now stripped of all authority, tried to maintain a presence. She showed up to meetings, avoided eye contact, and spoke only when addressed. But her damage was already done. Her approval rating among the board had dropped to single digits. Shareholders wanted her name nowhere near leadership. She handed in her resignation 3 weeks later. Jessica, my wife, was another story. She called a few times asking to talk. Said she had no idea things would go that far. Claimed she was caught in the middle. Didn't support what Madison did. Didn't trust Derek. Didn't know what to say at the time. Her excuses blurred into background noise. I gave her the same courtesy she gave me in that boardroom. Silence. With Madison gone and Richard quietly stepping back into retirement, the company was mine to reshape. I implemented strict financial oversight, appointed a new compliance director, and began rebuilding trust where it mattered most with the employees. The people who'd been pushed aside, reassigned, or demoralized under Madison's tenure were brought back into the fold. Morale rose, productivity surged, and the press began writing headlines about a Harrington comeback. But behind closed doors, I was preparing for my exit. This wasn't home. This wasn't a future. This was a proving ground. And now I had nothing left to prove. I went to the legal department and triggered the final clause in my contract, the one that Richard had insisted on when he asked me to return. It was called the CEO Contingency Clause, and it spelled out the terms under which I could activate a full buyout of my equity, IP ownership, and operational contributions. Based on the recovery value I created, the company owed me $38 million in liquid assets. Cash. Not stock. Not promises. I scheduled one final board meeting. Madison was there, seated at the far end of the table, now just another shareholder. Richard sat in silence, knowing what was coming. I'm stepping down, I said. The room didn't speak. I continued. But before I go, I'm enacting the terms of my exit clause. The company will execute the buyout effective immediately. I handed the legal documents across the table. The CFO flipped through the pages, eyes widening with every section. This will drain our cash reserves, he said. I nodded. It's not my problem. Madison's face went pale. She started to speak, then stopped. Richard leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. No words, just quiet resignation. Nobody could challenge the contract. It was signed, filed, binding. They let me back in, and I made sure every dotted line led to this moment. When the meeting ended, I left my access card on the table and walked to the lobby. No farewell speeches, no photos, just clean departure. Madison caught up to me as I was heading for the exit. Why? She asked, her voice flat. Why destroy everything? I turned to her, the same calm I'd held since the day they fired me. I didn't destroy anything. You did. I just gave it back to you. She looked at me like she didn't understand. Maybe she didn't. You thought I was just a piece on your board, I said. But I was the board. She stayed quiet as I stepped outside. I got into the waiting car and didn't look back. I had built their future once. They didn't value it. Now they could try building it without me. Good luck with that. After I left the building, I didn't return home. Home didn't exist anymore. Not the physical one, not the marriage, not the life I'd built around the Harringtons. I checked into a private rental under a different name and turned off my phone for 3 days. The silence was deliberate. I wasn't hiding, I was choosing peace. But the outside world moved fast. News of my departure spread within hours. Investors panicked briefly, until it became clear I hadn't taken proprietary data with me. I'd left the company intact, just not in the way they were used to. The systems I'd designed now ran on autonomous protocols, smart enough to maintain operations, but without my direct oversight. The company could function. It just wouldn't grow. That was the final lesson. They could either preserve what I left them or watch it decay. Richard sent an email. Short, formal. You were right. We were wrong. I hope you find what you're looking for. I didn't reply. Madison posted a polished LinkedIn update the following week. Stepping away from executive leadership to explore new opportunities in digital transformation and strategy. A photo of her smiling with crossed arms, as if the past 6 months hadn't happened. I didn't care what she did next. The chapter was closed. Jessica, on the other hand, made one last attempt to reach me, this time through my attorney. A letter, handwritten. She said she regretted staying quiet in that boardroom. Claimed she didn't know how to defend me without risking her own standing in the family. Said she loved me but wasn't strong enough. That last part, at least I believed. I didn't respond to her either. I used a portion of the buyout money, just a fraction, to set up a venture fund. Quiet, focused, and intentional. No flashy branding, no PR campaigns. I built it for people like me, founders who had the ideas but not the access. Underdogs with potential who just needed someone to take them seriously. The rest of the money went into an account that only 2 people had access to, me and my future. I chose a coastal town far from the city, one where nobody recognized my name or cared what I had done. I found a modest home on the edge of the shore and started over. Not to prove anything, not to build another empire, but to live on my own terms. It didn't take long before I met someone. Someone who didn't care about the Harringtons or logistics software or corporate takeovers. She asked me once what I used to do. I fixed problems, I said. That was enough for her. Back in the city, Harrington Logistics kept running. Barely. The board tried to install a new CEO, but the market had lost confidence. The cash hit from my buyout forced them to sell off 2 of their satellite hubs. Operational cuts followed. They downsized, rebranded, struggled to keep talent. Madison, last I heard, was offering executive coaching sessions online for mid-level managers trying to climb the corporate ladder. Her profile boasted experience in crisis leadership and strategic pivots. She still had followers, but the ones who mattered had moved on. Richard, now fully retired, was rarely seen in public. No more board meetings, no more yachts, just an old man with too much money and not enough power. And me? I walked the shoreline every morning. No more phones, no boardrooms, no strategy decks or budget wars. Just the sound of waves and the knowledge that I had finally, completely, and unapologetically walked away from a world that only ever saw my value when they were about to lose it. That was the difference between them and me. They chased status. I built it and then chose to leave it behind. 6 months after I left the Harringtons behind, the final chapter wrote itself. I hadn't planned to check in on them. But one afternoon, a former colleague forwarded me a headline from a regional business journal. Harrington Logistics announces emergency restructuring amid continued decline. The company had never fully recovered from the blow I'd delivered. They tried to maintain a facade, hiring interim CEOs, launching PR campaigns, but the foundation was gone. Not just technical infrastructure, but trust. Clients saw the instability. Partners hesitated. Talent fled. The systems I had built were still running, but they hadn't been updated. No innovation, no forward momentum. The company was operating like a museum exhibit, frozen in time, decaying slowly. Some might call it sabotage. I call it consequence. When you build your empire on someone else's shoulders and then try to push them out, don't be surprised when everything collapses. I had given them every opportunity to do the right thing. They chose arrogance. They gambled on appearances. And when it all fell apart, they had no one left who could hold the structure together. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't feel satisfaction, just clarity. What happened to me was betrayal. What happened to them was a correction. The venture fund I started quietly grew. I funded 12 small companies, founders from underserved backgrounds, people with ideas that didn't fit the usual mold. We focused on sustainability, ethical tech, and community-driven growth. Nothing flashy, just solid work done right, and something unexpected happened. I began hearing stories from people I'd helped. Letters, emails, thank you messages from founders who said that for the first time, someone had believed in them without asking for a piece of their soul. One wrote, "You gave me what no one else would, space to try." That hit differently. I never got that kind of space when I was climbing. I had to fight for every inch. And once I'd made it, they still saw me as expendable. But here I was, giving others what I was never given. That was the real legacy. Not the empire I built for the Harringtons, but the one I left behind in pieces, and the one I was now building on my own terms. I never heard from Jessica again. Last I checked, she'd moved to a smaller city and returned to teaching. Maybe she found peace. Maybe not. Either way, she belonged to a chapter one no longer reread. Madison continued to hustle online, rebranding herself every few months. Digital strategist, career reinvention coach, personal branding expert. Her posts were polished, the kind you see and scroll past because they don't say anything real. That was always her way, chasing image over substance. And Richard? Still alive, still wealthy, but now a shadow in the corporate world he once ruled. The new generation didn't know his name. The old guard had moved on. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled things, if I could have taken a softer approach. But the truth is, I didn't start the war. I just refused to lose it quietly. They fired me thinking I'd disappear. Instead, I turned their power into leverage and walked away richer in every way. I left with more than just money. I left with self-respect, freedom, and the ability to build without limits. That's what they never understood. Power isn't about titles or corner offices. It's about control over your own life. And when someone tries to take that from you, the only real response is to take it back, on your own terms. So that's what I did. I didn't just survive their betrayal. I turned it into a blueprint. Now others are following it. And the Harringtons? They're just a cautionary tale.